Welcome in. Subscribe if you're new, comment your location, and subscribers keep the hype points coming. I left Pine Valley on a back road at dusk, headlights low because the main highway had filled with stalled cars and frantic lights, and I wanted the mountains' silence instead. The Watchtower sat on a granite ridge like an old sentinel, its stilts planted deep, weathered paint flaking, windows clouded with bird dust and smoke from far below that drifted. I cut the engine under a leaning pine, left the car keyed but unlocked, took my pack and climbed the steep trail with boots scraping stone and breath forming ghosts. Wind carried a bitter tang of burned timber and something metallic. The valley below was a scattered city of firelight and shadow, its roads like veins pulsing with abandoned sound. Up close, the tower's joints held stubbornly. Someone had reinforced a crossbeam years ago with scavenged steel, nails driven like promises into aged grain and splintered wood and rusted bolts. Inside the cabin, a fold-down cot leaned against a wall, maps tacked in yellowed rows, a rusted radio on the desk with its dial frozen between stations once meant rescue. I ran fingers along calloused log edges, lifted a tarp to reveal a water barrel, a dented fuel can, and a toolkit low on essentials but still worth salvaging today. I set traps at the trailhead from wire and nails, sharpened stakes harvested from an old fence, and tested the radio until static greeted me like an old, indifferent friend. As twilight folded into night, I climbed to the deck, binoculars cold in my palms, watching the valley turn into embered dots where any light could betray a life now. A single distant wail broke the night's thin skin, then another answered, creating a corridor of sound that trickled up like water through hollow pipes and kept me listening closely. I palmed the radio and whispered into its dead mouth, naming my position, giving latitude and landmark, a ritual more for steadiness than hope because hope travelled like smoke elsewhere. Night thickened. Wind sharpened into cold nails that scraped seams, and I tightened every bolt while the valley breathed below with slow, patient, terrifying tempos that measured seconds into prayers. I set a watch schedule, hours sliced into shifts where one of us slept and the other watched the horizon for movement, for smoke, for the flare of human error. When the hikers stumbled onto my perimeter the next morning, I watched them for a long beat, gauging their gait, gear, and the tiny ways fear rearranged their faces slowly. I let them in after questions and silence. Americans from Fort Carson with dirt-streaked uniforms, spare water, and stories of highways clogged with bodies and vehicles left like abandoned homes. I reached the Watchtower just after sunrise, the sky washed in pale gold that softened the harsh ridgeline stretching towards the distant Colorado border. The structure stood on its spindly steel legs like an aging guardian refusing to abandon its post, weather-beaten but stubbornly intact despite decades of storms. I climbed the grated steps slowly, listening for any loose bolts or strained joints that might hint at deeper trouble, because trusting old metal without inspection felt reckless after everything happening below. At the landing, I paused, letting the wind push the mountain's cold breath across my face before unlocking the creaking door with the spare key I kept from my volunteer days. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, dust, and faint electrical burn from a lamp that must have blown months before the outbreak. A stack of topographical maps curled at the edges beside a cracked thermos and a ranger's logbook filled with weather notes, wildfire warnings, and small personal entries that stopped abruptly 2 summers ago. I checked every corner for signs of intrusion, finding only mouse droppings near a torn bag of trail mix and scratch marks that belonged to nothing more sinister than a restless raccoon. The windows needed cleaning, but they offered a sweeping view of the valley where smoke rose in disorganized plumes, marking neighborhoods that no longer held boundaries or safety. I tapped the radio again, hoping its silence had been temporary, but it rewarded me with the same indifferent static that greeted me last night. Still, having walls around me felt like a victory. I moved through the cabin, tightening hinges, testing floorboards, and cataloguing tools that could reinforce the tower before nightfall. Though solitude pressed close, it carried a strange relief. Nothing hunted the ridgeline yet. No shuffling shapes wandered the pines. For a fragile moment, the tower felt like the one place in Colorado still untouched by the world's collapse, a fragile sanctuary balanced above the chaos preparing to climb the mountain soon. I took a final slow walk around the outer deck, noting how each rail vibrated differently depending on the direction of the wind and the tension in the bolts anchoring it to the frame, and the subtle sway reminded me that survival here depended on attention, patience, and decisions made quietly long before danger reached the mountain's shadow. Those seconds shaped everything I would face in days ahead. The ridge felt wider in daylight, though the silence had a weight that settled over every pine needle. I stepped outside with my toolkit and walked the perimeter slowly, studying how the mountains sloped toward the narrow access trail carved decades ago for fire crews. That path would be the only direction trouble could approach from, human or otherwise, and if the outbreak spread beyond Pine Valley, I needed every advantage time and terrain could offer. I gathered fallen lodgepole trunks first, dragging them into place and stacking them in staggered rows to form a crude barricade. Colorado storms had dropped plenty of debris over the years. Now those remnants became the bones of my defense. From the storage shed beside the tower, I retrieved coils of rusted wire, a dented box of nails, and 2 warped metal signs left from an old trail reroute. I bent the signs into angled sheets, fastening them to wooden stakes to create obstacles that would trip anything shambling up the incline. The work steadied my breathing. Every clink of metal and crunch of dirt grounded me in purpose, a rhythm that pushed back the fear gathering in the pit of my stomach. Between hammer strikes, I listened for out-of-place sounds. Footfalls, voices, engines, but heard only wind threading through the pines and the distant hush of the valley still burning. The barricade grew gradually, a messy patchwork of logs braced with rocks to prevent roll. I wedged sharpened stakes into openings, driving them deep so the soil gripped at them tightly. The trail narrowed at a natural choke point near a boulder outcrop, and I concentrated my efforts there, creating a funnel no infected could move through quietly. When I tested the structure from different angles, it shifted only slightly, settling into the dirt as though accepting its new purpose. Sweat cooled against my back, and I brushed pine dust from my palms before walking a wider loop around the tower. I spotted gaps where movement could slip through under cover of night, so I placed braided wire along those blind spots, trip lines low enough to catch ankles. They weren't elegant, but they were effective. As I finished, the wind shifted, lifting the smell of smoke from the valley. It carried hints of gasoline fires, scorched timber, and something metallic that never belonged on mountain air. I paused, staring downhill at the faint shimmer of heat rising above the town. Whatever had happened overnight wasn't staying contained. The infected would move eventually, and noise carried easily along these ridges. I tightened the last wire knot and stepped back from the barricade. It wasn't beautiful, but it bought time, and up here time mattered more than distance. Inside the cabin, the air felt cooler than the mountain breeze, carrying the faint scent of old cedar and rain that had seeped through cracked window seals years before I returned. I shut the door behind me and let the quiet settle, absorbing the familiar creaks the structure made when the wind leaned against it. The tower wasn't large, just one square room perched on steel stilts, but its walls held decades of ranger stories, wildfire seasons, and lonely nights spent watching storms roll over the Rockies. I moved slowly, taking inventory with the same care I once used during volunteer rotations. A fold-down cot clung to the southern wall, its canvas dusty but sturdy. The central desk remained anchored by rusted bolts and still held a stack of laminated wildfire maps marked with evacuation routes, mile markers, and ridge elevation notes. Someone had left a ranger's mug beside the radio, chipped on one side, stained on the other. It made the place feel recently abandoned, as though the last watcher stepped out moments before the world collapsed. The radio sat crooked on its mount, dials stiff from disuse. I tapped it lightly, but the static humming through its circuits stayed unchanged. I marked it for later repairs. Nearby, a drawer revealed a half-filled first aid kit. Gauze, antiseptic, 2 compression wraps, and a cracked emergency whistle. Supplies mattered more than comfort now, so I set everything aside in labelled piles. The Watchtower's wraparound windows gave me a view worth more than any barricade. From the western pane, the peaks folded endlessly toward the horizon, blue and jagged. To the east, Pine Valley lay half-shadowed under a plume of smoke drifting over suburbs that once held families preparing morning coffee or weekend errands. Now none of those routines existed. Cars sat abandoned, tiny from this height. Fires flickered where gas lines ruptured. I checked the trapdoor leading to the emergency ladder. Its hinges still held firm. The storage cubby beside it offered canned goods left by previous crews. Beans, peaches, chili, even if half were expired. Hunger didn't discriminate, and neither did survival. The tower groaned when a strong gust pushed against its frame, reminding me that elevation brought both safety and fragility. A structure this tall resisted invaders but relied completely on its thin stilts staying anchored to rock. As the sun climbed higher, I cleaned the windows enough to see threat before it arrived. Every tool found a place, every bolt earned a second glance. The interior became less a relic and more a lifeline. If the streets weren't safe anymore, this tower had to be. Night arrived earlier than I expected, folding over the mountain ridge like a heavy blanket that smothered the last streaks of daylight. From the deck, I watched the sun sink behind the distant Rockies, leaving behind a faint amber glow that clung to the peaks before fading into deep blue. The valley below dimmed in uneven patches where fires still smouldered, flickering like dying signals from a world trying to stay lit. The smoke drifting upward turned darker with the cooling air, spreading across the foothills like a slow-moving storm cloud. I stepped back inside the tower and secured the door, feeling its familiar weight settle against the frame. The interior lights no longer worked, so I lit 2 battery lanterns and placed one on the desk and another near the cot. Their glow cast long shadows that swayed with each gust of wind pushing against the tower's steel legs. Those shadows, distorted by the windows, made the room feel occupied even when I was alone. The mountain, usually alive with the sounds of nocturnal wildlife, felt unnaturally silent. No owls. No distant elk calls. Not even the rustle of small animals foraging near the base of the tower. Instead, a colder, emptier quiet pulsed through the forest, a quiet shaped by fear or absence. My breath felt louder than it should have. I returned to the deck and aimed my binoculars toward Pine Valley. Streetlights that once outlined the town in clean grids now sputtered sporadically. Most neighborhoods lay completely dark. A few small fires burned on cul-de-sacs where vehicles had crashed or homes had been abandoned mid-escape. In the center of town, the hospital's generator flickered with a weak strobe, its rhythm unsettling against the stillness surrounding it. Then, on the wind, I heard them. Distant howls, faint but unmistakably human in shape and wrong in tone. They rose unevenly, echoed by others scattered across the valley. Their voices were neither coordinated nor random. They carried a searching quality, as though the infected were feeling their way through the night with sound. Each call sent an involuntary chill through my spine. I knew the infection had spread beyond containment, but hearing those cries drift up the mountain confirmed something deeper. Elevation didn't mean immunity. Sound travelled far in the cool night air, and whatever wandered Pine Valley now would eventually notice the tower's silhouette against the skyline. I stayed awake long after sunset, listening to the tower groan under the shifting wind. Every creak made me check the barricades. Every distant sound made me imagine footsteps climbing the trail. When sleep finally found me, it came only in small, restless fragments. Tomorrow the mountain would decide whether it kept me hidden or revealed me to whatever was climbing its slopes. Morning light seeped through the windows in muted streaks, filtered by a haze that hadn't been there the day before. At first I thought the weather had shifted overnight, but when I stepped onto the deck, the truth settled in my chest like a stone. A thick column of smoke rose from the outskirts of Pine Valley, twisting into the sky in slow, suffocating spirals. It wasn't the clean grey of a controlled burn or a chimney accident. This was darker, oil, rubber, timber, and everything else a desperate town might ignite in the chaos of a breakout. The breeze carried the scent up the mountain, acrid, metallic, and sharp enough to sting my eyes. I gripped the railing and scanned the valley through binoculars. The streets below, once neat grids lined with quiet homes and familiar storefronts, looked shredded. Cars were abandoned in tangled rows. Small fires flickered in driveways and cul-de-sacs. A single crashed ambulance lay half on its side near the high school, its roof dented as though something had thrown itself repeatedly against the metal. Movement caught my attention near the highway. Not traffic, those days were gone, but clusters of people stumbling across exit ramps and weaving between stalled vehicles. Their gait was uneven, heads lolling, arms hanging, drawn not toward escape but toward whatever sound drifted across their path. Even from this distance, their behavior was unmistakably wrong. They weren't navigating, they were following impulses. Farther west, I spotted survivors, 3, maybe 4, running along a bike path that skirted the river. They looked up towards the ridge, silhouettes small against the devastation around them. It struck me then how exposed they were, how little the open streets offered. Down there, hope had to be small, fragile, and constantly chased by hunger. Another plume of smoke rose suddenly, this one closer to downtown. A soft rumble followed seconds later, rolling up the hillside like distant thunder. Maybe a gas main ruptured. Maybe someone tried to burn out a cluster of infected. Maybe something else entirely. The infected didn't care about explanations. They reacted to vibration, heat, noise, anything the wind carried. More of them emerged from alleyways and parking lots, shambling toward the new sound with unsettling unity. I lowered the binoculars, pulse tightening. Whatever was happening in Pine Valley wasn't contained anymore. The outbreak wasn't spreading in waves, it was climbing. The valley no longer belonged to the living, and the mountain wouldn't remain untouched for long. Smoke had become a message drifting toward me. They're coming. By early afternoon, the mountain air had shifted again, carrying not only the distant noise of the valley, but something sharper, uneven footsteps on gravel, and the low murmur of exhausted voices. I froze on the deck, listening closely. The infected didn't speak, not in words or sounds resembling thought. These were different. Human. Frantic. Close, I hurried down the tower's metal steps until I could see the access trail that wound through the pines. Two figures staggered into view, their silhouettes wavering under the strain of the climb. Sunlight caught on their clothing, torn fatigues, dirt-smeared sleeves and reflective patches that marked them as military personnel. They were young, maybe late 20s, both limping, their packs half open and gear hanging loose, as if escape mattered more than the order. "Up here," I called out softly but firmly, careful not to project my voice farther than necessary. They lifted their heads in unison, eyes wide with the dull shock of people who'd seen too much too quickly. When they recognized the tower, something like relief flickered across their faces, though neither dared slow their pace. By the time they reached the barricades, both were trembling from exertion. The first collapsed to his knees, gripping the sharpened stakes I'd driven into the earth hours earlier. The second kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the woods for movement. She held a small hatchet in one hand, knuckles white around the handle. I stepped out from between the barricades, keeping distance until I was certain they weren't infected. "Any bites? Scratches?" I asked. The woman shook her head violently. "No, sir, nothing like that. Just running." The man nodded, though sweat streamed down his temples. We were stationed near Fort Carson. Evac routes failed. People turned fast. We headed north when the radios went dead. Their story came out in broken pieces. Colorado Springs had fallen into chaos within hours. Convoys were overrun. Civilians trampled each other trying to reach highways blocked by wrecks. Soldiers scattered in small groups, each trying to survive long enough to regroup. Except regrouping never happened. "Something changed today," the woman said, voice cracking. "They're moving different, like they know where sound comes from." I studied the ridge behind them. No movement, no figures testing the barricades yet. But fear had sharpened their instincts, and fear rarely lies. "Come inside," I said finally. "Rest. But stay quiet." They followed me into the tower's narrow entrance, their breath unsteady, boots dragging on the metal grate. For the first time since arriving on this mountain, I wasn't alone. But with company came responsibility and danger that could climb faster than any infected dot inside the tower. The air tightened with the presence of two more bodies. Space that once felt comfortably sparse now seemed barely enough to hold all our fears at once. The hikers, soldiers really, though stripped of everything that made them part of a system, dropped their gear near the cot and eased themselves onto the floorboards like people grateful just to stop moving. Their breaths came in uneven pulls, the kind you hear from those running more from memory than strength. I passed them water and watched as they drank in slow, controlled gulps. Habit, not courtesy. Rationing was a reflex you learned quickly once the world fell apart. The woman introduced herself as Avery. The man was Dalton. Both had dirt ingrained in their palms, and both glanced repeatedly at the windows as if expecting movement to rise from the tree line at any moment. We divided the interior into stations, one lantern by the maps, another near the trapdoor, gear stowed where it wouldn't rattle if the tower swayed. Avery volunteered for lookout. She lifted the binoculars with practiced precision, scanning the pines and the fractured valley below. Dalton checked their remaining supplies, a few protein bars, a cracked compass, 2 half-full canteens, and a bundle of paracord tied too neatly to be anything but military instinct clinging to order. Their presence didn't feel intrusive, just heavy with the truth they carried. Survival wasn't individual anymore. It had shifted into something shared, even if reluctantly. We took turns speaking in low voices, exchanging what we knew about the outbreak. They confirmed what I feared. The infected didn't stop at city limits. They drifted uphill, pulled by noise, light, movement. Pine Valley's collapse was only the beginning. when a distant thud echoed from somewhere down the ridge. Avery stiffened. Through the binoculars she spotted 3 silhouettes moving between tree trunks, slow and aimless but unmistakably infected. Their uneven strides tugged the breath from the room. They weren't close enough to threaten us yet, but close enough that ignoring them would have been denial. We shut the windows halfway to cut glare and dampen noise, moving with the careful rhythm of people who understood how sound travelled on open slopes. The infected in the valley continued their wandering patterns, but now some had begun drifting toward the ridges, as if the silence of the woods whispered directions. Night would come again soon, and with 3 of us inside the tower, the weight of defending it grew heavier. Still, for the first time since reaching this place, I wasn't facing the mountain alone. We waited until the afternoon shadows stretched long across the ridge before heading outside again. Reinforcing the tower legs meant exposing ourselves, and none of us wanted to risk drawing attention while the infected still drifted unpredictably in the tree line. Dalton carried the paracord and a handful of long bolts scavenged from the storage shed, while Avery kept watch with the binoculars perched on a boulder just above the trail. I hauled 2 warped metal sheets, old trail signs sun-bleached beyond recognition, and a toolbox filled with rusted wrenches. Up close, the tower's stilts looked older than I remembered. Years of Colorado winters had gnawed at their paint, leaving thin veins of rust creeping along the edges. The legs sank deep into concrete footings, but the upper joints were vulnerable, reachable if enough infected piled against them. Reinforcing them wouldn't make the structure invincible, but it would buy us precious minutes if something tried to climb. Dalton knelt beside the first support beam, bracing the bent metal sheet against its base. If they slam into this, the angle will force their weight off to the side, he murmured, voice low. Military training woven with improvisation. I handed him a wrench while I held the plate steady. Every strike of the bolt echoed across the hillside, making my stomach clench. Sound travelled too far out here. Avery hissed from her lookout perch. 2 silhouettes moving south of the ridge. Slow. Probably infected. We froze. The hammer hung mid-air in Dalton's grip. The wind shifted, carrying no additional sound. No groan, no footsteps crunching dead needles. But the tension in our chests didn't ease until Avery gave a subtle nod. They're veering downhill. Not toward us. We returned to the work with quieter urgency. I wrapped paracord around the second beam, weaving it through drilled holes, tightening it until the cord hummed under strain. Dalton added another angled plate, creating a crude barrier that would force anything approaching to stumble or crawl awkwardly. The mountain breeze carried the faint crackle of distant fires, the smell of smoke drifting up from Pine Valley like a warning spreading on the wind. When we reached the northern leg, the easiest one to climb if something learned how, Avery joined us, abandoning the lookout for a moment. Together we bolted the last metal sheet into place and braced it with rocks driven into the earth. Sweat clung to our clothes despite the cool mountain air. Fear had a way of heating the body. As we stepped back to evaluate our work, the tower cast a long shadow across the ridge. Reinforced legs, masked angles, trip lines ready. A temporary fortress. But even from here, we could see 3 infected wandering a few hundred feet below, drifting between pines with unsettling patience. The tower was safer now, but only for a while. Night settled over the ridge like ink spilled across the sky, blotting out the last traces of daylight until only the tower's lanterns cast faint halos on the interior walls. We kept them dim, just enough to navigate the cramped space without stumbling. Any brighter and the windows would glow like beacons. Any darker and the shadows would swallow our nerves whole. Outside, the wind shifted with a restless edge, carrying scents of wood smoke, cold granite, and something fouler drifting up from Pine Valley. Avery was first to hear the crunch of needles below the tower. She stiffened beside the western window, her breath freezing mid-sentence. Dalton and I joined her, each of us holding our breath without meaning to. For a moment the darkness remained still, inscrutable. Then movement broke through, a shambling silhouette emerging from the tree line, swaying with the slow inevitability of something that didn't know exhaustion or hesitation. It reached the barricades and collided with the sharpened stakes, recoiling only a little before pressing forward again. The stakes shifted under the pressure, but held. Dalton gripped the railing, jaw clenched. "Just one," he whispered. "Let's hope it stays that way." But it didn't. Two more figures drifted from the shadows. Their movements were disjointed, necks twisting in unnatural angles as if listening to vibrations I couldn't hear. One tripped over a boulder, rose without instinct to brush dirt from its clothes, and continued lurching toward the barricade. Their moans carried up the metal stilts of the tower, vibrating faintly in the floorboards beneath us. Each groan harmonized into a low, sick chorus. We dimmed the lantern further and crouched low. The infected pressed against the lower structure, hands scraping metal, bodies thudding rhythmically, each impact sending tremors through the stilts. The sound wasn't loud, but it was relentless, a pattern of dull impacts echoing like distant drums. "They know something's here," Avery murmured, voice cracking. "Maybe not us specifically, but something." The infected paced below, failing to understand the tower's elevation. They couldn't climb the metal legs easily, not yet, but instinct pushed them to linger. One reached up, fingers dragging across steel before slipping away. Another circled the base in uneven loops like a moth searching for heat. Hours crawled by as the infected drifted beneath us, arriving in small waves from different directions. Some lingered only minutes. Others stayed until their necks sagged from the strain of looking upward. None attempted to leave the ridge entirely. The tower creaked under shifting weight and wind, each groan merging with the chorus below. Dalton whispered, "They'll keep coming. Sound, movement, scent. Doesn't take much to draw them." "And once they learn this place doesn't fight back?" I asked quietly. "They'll tell the mountain with their noise." Avery swallowed hard. "Then they'll come in numbers." We remained awake the entire night, eyes fixed on the silhouettes below. The infected had not climbed the mountain by accident. They were claiming it. By morning, the infected had drifted back into the trees, leaving only footprints pressed deep into the soil and a lingering dread that clung to the tower's metal frame. Sleep had been a luxury none of us touched. Exhaustion pooled behind our eyes, but we didn't dare rest. Instead, I turned my focus to the one tool that might connect us to anyone still fighting out there. The old shortwave radio bolted to the desk. Its casing was sun-bleached and cracked, the knobs stiff with age. I unscrewed the panel carefully, revealing a nest of wires that looked more like a desperate attempt at survival than a functioning device. Dalton stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the tree line as if expecting the infected to reappear the moment we let our guard down. Avery knelt beside me, handing me tools from the kit without asking. Static growled through the speaker when I powered the unit. At first, it was the familiar hiss, white noise that washed over the room like an indifferent tide. But beneath that, faint, irregular flickers pulsed. Not quite voices, but not entirely mechanical either. Signals existed out there. Somewhere. If I could anchor the frequency, maybe we could find someone broadcasting. I reattached a loose ground wire and tapped the tuner, slowly sweeping through channels. The static shifted pitch. A clipped tone crackled. Avery leaned forward, eyes widening. Was that a voice? I stopped the dial at the micro-frequency where the noise dipped. Another burst came, fragmented words swallowed by distortion. Dalton lowered his rifle slightly, drawn towards the sound. Copy, perimeter breach. Request evac. Southwest. The message dissolved into static. My pulse kicked. Somebody out there was talking. Not civilians. Military. The cadence was unmistakable. I adjusted the tuner again, trying to chase the fragment. Another voice bled through, weaker this time, as if swallowed by distance or chaos. Springs. Holding for now. Casualties. Repeat. Fall back to... Then silence. Not even static. A flat void that made the room feel smaller. Avery exhaled shakily. Colorado Springs is still broadcasting. That means someone survived down there. Or they survived long enough to send that last message, Dalton muttered. His tone wasn't cruel, just honest in a way that carried its own weight. I swept the frequency range again, but nothing returned. No calls, no coordinates, just the familiar buzz of a world unraveling too quickly for communication to keep pace. Still, hearing those voices, even broken, fading, shifted something inside the tower. Our isolation wasn't absolute. Someone else was fighting, retreating, surviving, and whatever happened in the valley hadn't erased every stronghold yet. As I screwed the panel back into place, the wind pushed a low moan through the pines. Avery stepped to the window, scanning the slope again. Dalton took first watch without being asked. The radio hadn't saved us. It hadn't promised rescue. But it reminded us of one thing: we weren't out of time yet. The second night brought no warning, just the slow, gathering pressure of danger settling over the ridge like a storm that didn't bother with thunder. We heard them before we saw them. Low murmurs drifting between the pines, brush cracking under uncoordinated feet, the subtle shift of bodies pushing against undergrowth. Avery raised her binoculars, scanning the slope with steady breaths that betrayed the tremble in her fingers. Dalton chambered around without sound, eyes narrowing toward the trail. Then the first infected stepped into view. It moved with that same unsettling sway we'd seen before, hesitant yet purposeful, as if guided by some invisible thread pulling it uphill. Another followed. Then another. Shadows stretched behind them, merging into a loose formation of bodies shambling towards the tower's legs. What chilled me wasn't their speed, but their numbers. Not a swarm yet, but more than the exploratory handful we'd seen the night prior. They're tracking noise, Avery whispered, or scent, or both. Dalton grit his teeth. Doesn't matter how. They're learning the ridge exists. We killed the lanterns completely, letting the tower sink into darkness. Only thin moonlight filtered through the windows, casting pale lines across the floorboards. I stepped lightly from window to window, verifying the barricades below. The infected had reached the first row of logs and metal sheets. They pressed against them, testing the resistance, bodies leaning as if memory of balance had long since deteriorated. The barricades held, wood creaking, metal bending slightly, but holding. More appeared from the north tree line. A crooked silhouette stumbled into the open, its arms jerking at odd intervals. Watching them gather felt like witnessing gravity at work. They weren't coordinated, but they were inevitable. The ridge funneled sound upward, drawing them like moths toward a flame they couldn't name. Hours passed. We traded watch shifts without speaking. The infected never truly dispersed. They crowded beneath the tower legs, pacing in slow arcs, their moans bleeding together into an ambient hum that buzzed through the steel supports. Every vibration travelled up into the floorboards, rattling loose pens on the desk and sending ripples through the lantern's glass. Hunger gnawed at us. Not for food, we still had enough ration bars tucked away, but for rest, for even a fraction of sleep deeper than a blink, but none of us dared close both eyes. Every thump against the tower base jolted our nerves. Every groan reached inside our chests and squeezed. At one point, an infected slammed into a metal plate with surprising force, sending a jolt through the entire structure. Avery inhaled sharply. Dalton gripped the railing until his knuckles blanched. "They're not leaving tonight," I whispered. No one argued. The mountain had lost its silence. The siege had begun. By dawn, the infected still lingered below, drifting in slow circles beneath the tower like debris caught in a whirlpool. The sound of their moans had dulled into a constant vibration, a background hum that scraped at our nerves until even silence felt loud. None of us had slept. Not really. We took turns resting against the walls, but every creak of steel jolted us awake again. Exhaustion didn't just weigh on the body, it gnawed at the edges of judgment. Dalton paced near the trapdoor, bootsteps thudding too loudly for comfort. "This won't hold forever," he muttered. "They gather every night. More will follow. This isn't a stronghold. It's a waiting room." Avery shot him a look sharp enough to cut metal. "It's safer than going downhill. You saw the valley. The roads are choked. The woods are crawling with them." "Maybe," he fired back, "but at least down there we have mobility. Up here we're trapped on stilts." The argument had been simmering for hours, and now lack of sleep yanked their restraint apart. Dalton's voice rose, echoing off the walls. "We stay much longer, and we're boxed in. If the infected pile up, if the tower legs weaken, we'll fall with it. I'm not dying in some metal birdhouse." Avery stood, fists clenched. "Running blind in the mountains is suicide." "I'm not suggesting blind," Dalton snapped. "I'm suggesting movement. We can't win a siege." Their voices clashed, overlapping until the tower felt smaller than ever. The infected below shifted, reacting to the vibrations of our tension. I stepped between them, palms raised. "Enough," I said, forcing calm into the word. "Noise carries. You're going to send a signal up this mountain louder than any flare." Silence hit harder than the argument. Avery turned away, pressing her palms against the glass. Dalton rubbed his temples, pacing again, but softer. The truth sat between us like a coiled wire. Both of them were right. Staying meant eventual collapse. Leaving meant uncertain death. I leaned against the desk, letting my gaze sweep the room. Maps, tools, supplies dwindling by the hour. 3 people trying to outthink an evolving threat. Fatigue made the cabin feel off balance, like the floor leaned even though the tower was steady. Avery finally spoke, voice thinner than before. "I just don't want to die running." Dalton exhaled through his nose. "And I don't want to die waiting." Neither had an answer. Neither did I. But as the infected pressed their weight against the barricades below and the wind rattled the tower frame, one truth settled heavy in my gut. The mountain wasn't going to stay patient much longer. And neither were we. Late afternoon brought a strange hush to the ridge, the kind that made birds pause and windstall mid-gust. The infected below had thinned, wandering back into the trees with that eerie, drifting aimlessness they carried when no stimulus pulled them. For a moment, just a moment, the mountain felt like itself again. Quiet, breathable, almost gentle. Then the roar tore through the silence. It came from the west, raw, guttural, unmistakably from something alive and desperate. The three of us jerked towards the window in unison. Between the pines, a large shape barreled upward through the undergrowth, tearing loose branches and sending rocks tumbling down the slope. A black bear, ribs visible beneath its matted fur, eyes wide with panic and starvation, sprinted straight towards the tower's barricades. Avery whispered, "Oh no!" The bear slammed into the first row of logs with a force that shook the ground. Bark splintered, stakes bent. The entire barricade shuddered inward from the impact. Hunger had driven it mad. The wildfires in the valley must have chased it from its territory, leaving it disoriented and frantic. But the bear's roar carried farther than its fear. Within seconds, scattered groans rose from the forest. Infected silhouettes appeared through the trees, turning towards the noise with unnatural synchronicity. They stumbled and collided as they converged, drawn to the bear's struggle as if its fear and movement were a beacon. "Perfect," Dalton muttered. "Just what we needed." The bear reared up, striking the barricade again with clawed paws. The infected reached it moments later, swarming around its flanks. The animal spun, roaring and swiping with strength born from terror, sending two infected tumbling down the incline. But for every one it pushed away, three more pushed back. The sound, their snarls and its roars, echoed up the stilts, vibrating the floor beneath our boots. The tower trembled in subtle pulses, rattling loose screws on the desk. The bear fought with raw, desperate power. It knocked several infected into the second barricade row, snapping stakes and shaking the frame. Avery flinched with every impact. Dalton raised his rifle but lowered it again instantly. Firing would draw everything within miles. "It won't survive," I said quietly. And it didn't. One infected latched onto its hind leg, then another onto its shoulder. The bear's roars grew ragged, collapsing into strained bellows as the weight of the swarm toppled it sideways. The barricade cracked under their combined mass. A segment of the wooden frame gave way, sliding downhill in a cascade of shattered logs and claw marks. The infected pressed forward where the bear had fallen, trampling it without hesitation. The ridge fell into a chilling stillness. Only the tower kept breathing. But the message was clear. If the wild was breaking, the mountain's last defenses were breaking with it. When the bear's final roar faded into a wet silence, the ridge felt different, as if something fundamental in the mountain had shifted. Avery stayed at the window, her breath fogging the glass while Dalton and I descended the first few steps of the tower to assess the damage. The infected had scattered again, drifting back into the trees in loose, staggering patterns, leaving behind only broken stakes, smeared earth and deep claw furrows carved into the barricade. But the real damage wasn't on the ground. It was in the steel. The moment my boots hit the lower landing, a faint tremor rippled through the tower's frame. Not caused by movement, not caused by wind, this came from the structure itself, adjusting under new strain. I crouched and ran my fingers along one of the stilts. The metal was warm, vibrating with uneven pulses. I examined the bolts around the midjoint and spotted it. The hairline crack forming along the weld, thin as a thread but unmistakably growing. "Dalton," I called softly. "This leg took more force than we realized." He knelt beside me, eyes narrowing. "That's not from the infected. The bear hit this beam like a truck." Another vibration hummed through the steel, deeper this time. The upper cabin creaked overhead, shifting weight with a subtle tilt I felt in my spine. Avery leaned out the window above us. "What's happening?" she whispered. "The tower's complaining," Dalton said, "louder than usual." We clambered back up to the cabin and shut the hatch behind us. The entire structure seemed to breathe in uneven intervals, metal expanding and contracting, wood complaining under angles it wasn't designed to bear. The slight tilt to the north wasn't visible yet, but my balance noticed it. My instincts confirmed the rest. "We need to reinforce the supports again," Avery said. Dalton shook his head slowly. "That's not reinforcement damage. That's foundational stress. If that weld keeps splitting, the whole tower could lean. And if it leans too far?" she asked. "It folds. We go with it." Silence draped over us like a thick tarp. I paced to the eastern window and looked towards the valley. Smoke continued to thicken above Pine Valley, merging with clouds and blotting out any remaining sunlight. The outbreak had torn through the town like a wildfire that didn't burn out, and now its victims were wandering into the mountains drawn by sound, scent, or instinct. The tower wasn't designed for siege. It was meant for observation. Lightweight, tall, flexible in storms, but never intended to withstand repeated impacts from desperate creatures and panicked animals. For the first time since arriving, I felt the tower sway under a wind too gentle to justify the motion. Avery noticed it too. "We can't stay here forever." "No," I said quietly, gripping the railing as another tremor passed through the floor. "The question isn't whether we leave." Dalton finished the thought for me, voice low and certain. "It's whether we get out before this tower decides it's done holding us up." We cleared the table of old ranger logs and unrolled a stack of topographical maps, their creases worn soft from years of wildfire planning. Avery weighed down the corners with lantern batteries while Dalton hovered over the ridgelines, tracing possible routes with a finger still smudged from checking the tower's damaged weld. The infected hadn't returned yet, but their absence only tightened the urgency in the room. We weren't planning a route for if anymore. This was preparation for when. I tapped the map near our position. The main trail is off limits, too exposed, too predictable. If the infected follow sound or movement patterns, that's the first place they'll drift. Dalton nodded. Agreed. Woodland Park's road network is probably already compromised. We'd be funneled straight into a choke point. Avery shifted her focus eastward, her expression tightening. "What about the ridge? The old switchbacks used for controlled burns. They drop toward the ranger station." "Too many blind corners," Dalton countered. "And if even one infected wanders onto the trail behind us, the narrow sections would trap us." I studied the contours carefully. Between the steep drop-offs and the granite shelves, the mountain offered few forgiving paths. But one stood out, not a trail, not even a marked route, just a natural pathway formed by a boulder slide years ago. "This," I said, pointing to the shaded slope north of the tower. "The boulder field. It's messy, but infected move terribly on uneven ground. If we stay high and cross the upper section, we can drop toward the ranger station from behind." Avery traced the path with slow, deliberate movements. "Elevation's rough. Loose rock. We'll have to move light." That meant leaving supplies behind, half of what we'd stocked in the tower, maybe more. The thought twisted my stomach, but weight slowed survival. And if the tower was nearing its final hours, supplies wouldn't matter if we were buried under it. Dalton exhaled. "If we commit, there's no turning back. Once we hit the rocks, we can't climb back to the tower fast. And if we're wrong, we won't be," I said, though certainty wasn't something I owned anymore. The wind rattled the windows then, just a soft nudge, but enough to remind us the tower's frame was starting to lose its resilience. Every shift felt deeper, heavier. Avery rolled up the map and slipped it into her pack. "Then we map our escape. Tonight we gather. Tomorrow we prep. And after that, we leave," I finished. The mountain, once a refuge, had become a countdown. The cabin felt smaller the moment we acknowledged we were leaving it behind. Every item suddenly demanded judgment. What stayed, what came, what might save a life, what might cost one. Avery spread our supplies across the floorboards, grouping them into piles lit by the dim lantern. Food, tools, rope, medical gear, water. Dalton leaned against the desk, staring at the metal stilts through the window, as if he could hear the weld weakening by the second. "We pack light," I said, though the words felt like a betrayal of everything we'd built here. "Weight slows us down on the boulder field." Avery nodded and began dividing ration bars. 3 each, water next. Dalton lifted a canteen and weighed it in his hand. 1 full per person, 1 half. Anything more will drag us. Leaving water behind felt almost criminal, but climbing over loose rock required balance more than abundance. We filled 3 canteens and set the rest aside, an unspoken hope someone might use them if they found this place after us. The first aid kit came next. Gauze, antiseptic, wraps, painkillers, every piece had value, but the kit was too bulky. I tore it apart and kept only the essentials, fitting them into a smaller pouch. Avery pointed at the signal mirror and a packet of waterproof matches. "Bring those. If we get lost or separated—" "We won't," Dalton interrupted. But she packed them anyway. Tools were trickier. The hatchet was non-negotiable. The multi-tool, paracord, and a small spool of wire were added next. The fire axe, useful in close quarters, was far too heavy for a mountain descent. Choosing to leave it behind scraped something raw in my throat. Clothes came last. Colorado nights were cold even without the wind tearing down the ridges, but carrying extra layers wasn't possible. We stripped it down to 1 spare shirt each and gloves tied to our packs. Dalton found a pair of old ranger binoculars wedged behind the desk and handed them to me. "You're best with distance." We packed in near silence, each movement shaped by fatigue and urgency. The infected remained quiet below, but the tower wasn't. It creaked in long, uneasy breaths, as if bracing itself for a collapse it had no strength left to resist. Avery cinched her backpack and glanced around the room. Hard to believe we were safe here, even for a little while. "We weren't safe," I said. "We were just ahead of the danger." Dalton slung his pack onto his shoulders. "Not anymore." The tower swayed just slightly, enough to remind us that time was running out. We were no longer deciding if we would go. We were deciding how quickly we needed to be gone. Dusk stained the ridge in muted orange when we stepped onto the deck, each of us carrying a piece of the plan that felt too fragile to trust, but too necessary to ignore. The infected hadn't returned in large numbers since the bear incident, but shadows still shifted restlessly between the trees, drifting like debris caught in uncertain currents. If we wanted any chance of slipping into the boulder field unnoticed, we had to pull them away from the tower, far enough that they wouldn't hear us climb down, far enough that they wouldn't follow the moment we crossed the first ridge. Dalton set the metal cans on the floor and unraveled the thin speaker wires we'd scavenged from the broken radio. Avery checked the old battery pack twice, her hands steady despite the exhaustion threading her voice. When the device crackled to life, a faint static hum filled the cabin. Not a broadcast, not a signal. Just sound. And sound was all we needed. "We drag it downhill," I said, looping the longest rope around the canister. "Let the noise roll with the slope. They'll follow the strongest source." Avery gave a small nod. "Just keep out of sight. If even one sees you—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. We lowered the device from the deck carefully, letting it dangle a moment before guiding it onto the ground. Then, keeping low, Dalton and I crept down the steps and inched toward the barricades. The mountain air felt colder this close to dusk, carrying the sharp scent of sap and charred pine. Every footstep seemed louder than it should have been. Dalton raised a hand and whispered, "Ready?" I flicked the switch. Static burst from the canister, loud enough to carry, scattered enough to sound unnatural. The infected reacted almost immediately. A lone figure near the tree line jerked its head toward the sound, limbs twitching in sharp, disjointed movements. Another emerged from behind a fallen log, weaving toward the noise. Their attention locked onto that single point of disturbance, their movements synchronizing in the unsettling way we'd seen before. "Pull it," I whispered. Dalton tugged the rope slowly, dragging the rattling canister down the slope. The metal scraped against rocks, amplifying the racket. More infected emerged. 4, 6, a dozen, drifting toward the shifting sound. Avery watched from the deck, signaling each new straggler attracted to the noise. They followed in a loose current, stumbling deeper into the forest, farther from the tower, farther from our escape. When the last silhouette vanished into the pines, Avery's whisper cracked through the radio we carried. "They're moving. Now's your chance." The infected were following the decoy. And for the first time since reaching the tower, the trail below lay open. We didn't waste a second. The moment Avery confirmed the infected had drifted into the pines, we moved. Packs tightened, tenduned, boots laced, breath held against the cold air that suddenly felt sharper than before. Dalton climbed down the emergency ladder first, his steps precise despite exhaustion. I followed, gripping the rungs with palms slick from nerves. The tower creaked above us, releasing a long metallic groan that made me glance upward instinctively, half expecting the entire structure to tilt again. The ground felt foreign beneath my feet after so many days suspended above it. Earth shifted. Pine needles cushioned each step. The slope pulled at my balance immediately, reminding me how quickly gravity could turn treacherous on the mountain. Avery descended last, pausing once at the bottom to sweep the ridge with her flashlight, shielded beneath her jacket to avoid casting beams uphill. "Clear," she whispered. We slipped into the boulder field quietly, each movement deliberate. Rocks, some the size of basketballs, others as large as sheds, formed a chaotic landscape that punished careless steps. A single misstep could send a cascade of noise down the ridge. Dalton moved confidently, weaving through channels of stone with the muscle memory of someone trained to navigate uncertainty. Avery stayed close behind him, her breath steady but shallow. I kept to the rear, turning often to watch the tower. Its silhouette stood tall against the fading sky, leaning slightly more to one side than it had that morning. The reinforced legs glinted faintly, but from here I could see the split weld, now a thin crack visible even at a distance. It was a matter of time before gravity won. Loose gravel shifted under my boot, skittering down the slope. I froze. Avery looked back, eyes wide, but the sound died quickly between the rocks. No movement stirred in the trees below. We pressed on, climbing across angled slabs and squeezing between narrow stone corridors carved by seasonal runoff. The boulder field shielded us well. Its uneven terrain broke our outlines, hid our heat, and masked our steps. The wind carried distant echoes, rustling branches, faint moans far behind us. The tower creaking like a tired sentinel finally giving up its post. Dalton raised a hand, signaling a pause. "Halfway," he breathed. "The ranger station's beyond that ridge." Avery nodded. I looked back once more. The tower stood alone now, silent, battered, holding a place in the mountain like an old friend we were forced to abandon. Then we turned and continued downward, leaving the last height of safety behind us. The ridge dropped sharply after the boulder field, funneling us into a narrow chute of scrub oak. and fallen branches that snapped softly under our weight. The air grew warmer as we descended, carrying the unmistakable scent of burned timber mixed with something acrid and synthetic. When the tree line finally thinned, the old ranger station came into view, outlined by a weak orange glow that flickered in uneven pulses.
Most folks
It had
glance
burned
up at a tower
recently.
crane and see a machine.
Char
They don't
streaked
stop
the
to think about
exterior
the guy
walls,
sitting in the glass
curling the
box
wood like
300
dried
feet in the
leaves.
air.
The
That
roof
was me.
sagged inward,
I'm
smoke
Darren
still
Creed.
snaking
I
out
ran a
through
hammerhead
broken
crane
shingles.
for a mid-sized
A section
outfit
of
in
the
a city
front
that
porch
was
had
always
collapsed
loud, but
entirely,
never really went
leaving
anywhere.
splinters scattered across
The
the
job
dirt.
description was simple enough on paper.
The fire wasn't strong enough to
Show
still
up
be
before
consuming the
sun,
structure,
climb the mast,
but it hadn't
put the
gone
hook
cold
exactly
either.
where the radio told me to,
Someone had
and try
set
not
this
to
place
squash
alight
anyone
not
or
long
break
ago.
anything that cost more than my truck.
Dalton held up a
My
fist,
mornings were strict routine.
signaling a stop.
Gas station sludge that passed for
Avery
coffee,
and I
a
ducked
dark
behind a
commute past
cluster
strip
of
malls
split
that were
boulders,
barely waking
watching
up.
the station from a
Ground
safe
level
distance.
was pure chaos.
No movement,
Diesel fumes, deep
no
mud, and a
voices,
tangled mess of
no
rebar that
silhouettes
looked
shifting
like a metal
behind the
spider
shattered
web.
windows.
Men in
But the
hard
quiet
hats yelling
felt
over idling
manufactured,
concrete mixers.
as if whatever happened here had
To me,
scared
that was
everything,
just noise.
living or
The shift
infected,
didn't officially
away
start
from the
until my
perimeter.
boots hit the first rung of the ladder.
We
bolted
approached
inside the
slowly,
mast.
circling
That
the
climb,
building's left
it
flank.
was a workout all on its own.
A metal trash can lay
Vertical steel,
overturned
no
near the back
elevator,
door,
no easy way
riddled
up.
with dents.
In August, those
Spent
rungs were
shell
hot enough to
casings
blister your
littered the
hands
dirt.
through leather gloves.
223
the
and
cold
9
sucked the heat
mm,
right out of your
scattered
bones.
like breadcrumbs from a
There were
firefight
rest
fought
landings
too
every
quickly
20
to
feet or
control.
so. You could stop,
Avery
catch
knelt
your breath,
beside one
pretend
casing
you were
and
inspecting
touched
the
it with
bolt,
her
but you
glove.
couldn't linger.
Still
the ground
warm,
crew knew if you were
she
dragging
whispered.
ass.
Someone fired
So
these
you
less
kept
than an
hauling
hour ago.
yourself up hand over hand,
That meant
until the
survivors,
trucks down below
or
looked
it
like
meant the
matchbox
infected
cars,
had been
and the
here
only
recently
sound
enough
left
to
was the
force them
wind
to
ripping
retreat.
around the cab.
Neither option eased
Up
the
top, it was
tension
just me and
climbing
the
my
machinery.
spine.
The cab is basically a fishbowl,
Inside, the
a
station
seat,
was a
two
maze of
joystick
charred
controllers,
furniture
a
and
heater that only
ash-swept
worked when
floors.
it felt generous,
Maps
and a
curled
view
on the
that cost
walls,
a fortune.
their edges
I kept
blackened.
a faded photo taped
A
to the
desk
sleep
lay
panel and a cooler
overturned near
tucked
the
under
entrance,
seat.
drawers ripped
From
out
down
and
on the
scattered.
sidewalk,
The
crane
radio
was just
stand
part
was
of the
smashed,
skyline.
its
But from my
components
seat, the
melted
city
into the
felt
wood.
distant, disconnected.
Someone had
like a
tried to
movie playing on a
destroy
silent
whatever
screen.
could be used against them,
I liked it that
or
way.
whatever was
I
chasing
figured
them.
that gap between me and the
A
concrete would
faint
always be
groan
enough to keep the
drifted
world's
from
problems at
outside,
arm's length.
snapping every
On
muscle
paper,
in my
job
body
was a dull
tight.
checklist of load
Dalton
charts and
raised his
OSHA
rifle,
safety specs, but
motioning us
inside my
toward the
head, it
far
broke
corner of the
down to
room,
3 simple
where a broken
commandments.
window offered a narrow
Get up the
exit.
stick, swing the iron clean,
Avery
and get
peeked
back
through the
down in
frame
one
and
piece.
shook her head.
Everything
"They're coming,"
in between was just the
she
waiting
whispered,
game. Hurry
from
up
the
and
south
wait,
tree line.
waiting for the radio to
I moved
crackle with a
beside her.
command, waiting
Shadows
for the riggers to
moved
clear
between the
drop zone,
pines,
waiting for the
slow
wind gauge
but
to drop
deliberate.
just 1 damn mile per hour,
Not a
so we
swarm
could
yet,
move a heavy
but
panel
enough to
without
trap us
getting
if we
reamed out
stayed.
by the safety
The
officer.
ranger station had once been a
On a
waypoint,
typical
a
Tuesday,
safe
the rhythm
spot
was
for
hypnotic.
hikers and fire
The
crews.
ground crew, guys in
Tonight,
mud-caked
it would be a
orange
grave
vests,
if we lingered.
would scramble over the site
Dalton's
like
voice
beetles,
dropped
checking
to a
rigging
whisper.
and arguing over chains.
We run on my mark,
I'd watch them weave
We
between
tightened our
stacks
packs,
of rebar and formwork,
steadied our breath,
just waiting for the signal.
and prepared to move.
The foreman's voice
The
would cut
mountain
through
wasn't
the
done
static in
testing
my
us,
ear.
not even
Creed,
close.
I got a bundle
We
of
slipped out the
number 8
back
bar
of the
on
ranger
each
station
side.
just as the
Needs to go
infected
to the
pushed
third
through the
deck.
southern tree line in
Key
small,
the mine.
staggering
Copy
waves.
that. Send it.
Dalton
And ease the
guided
right
us into a
joystick
shallow
forward.
gully where
You
the
don't just
moonlight
jerk a
barely
crane, you
reached,
coax it.
crouching low
You
as
have
the
to feel
shapes
the weight
spread
before the
across the
motors
charred
even whine.
perimeter.
I drift the hook
Their
over
movements
the
were
load
slow,
inch by inch,
but
keeping it
unsettlingly
steady so nobody down
synchronized,
there lost a finger
drifting
or a
towards
hard
the
hat.
burned station as if
From
drawn
the
by the
cab, I
memory
saw
of
a version
gunfire.
of the city that most
From
people
our
never
hiding
get to
place,
see.
we could
It
hear
was
their
a
soft
sprawling map of
groans
office
weaving
towers,
through the
dirty
smoke,
brown curve of the
an
river,
eerie
neighborhoods
lullaby
packed
carried
tight around
uphill.
the skeletons of old
"We don't have
factories.
long," Dalton
I
whispered.
watched the traffic on the
Avery
road
nodded,
crawl like
tapping
a
the
dying
side of her
snake every
pack.
morning at rush
"The signal
hour,
gear's inside.
then break
If
loose
we're going
just
to
as the
try,
crew
it
broke
has to
for
be
lunch.
now." The gully
That view
curved around the back of the
should have made
station
me
and
feel
fed into a
important, like
narrow
a king
path
in a
that had
tower.
more rocks than soil.
Mostly it just made the
We
problems
followed
on the
it
ground
carefully,
look pathetic.
boots muted by damp
Rent,
earth and
gas
ash.
prices, arguments with the
As we
ex.
rounded the
From
station's
200
far
feet up,
side,
they all
a
blurred
faint
into the
glimmer
same
caught
gray
my eye,
concrete strip.
a reflection
It's hard to
bouncing
stress about
weakly
a
from
passing
inside
build
what
when the
remained
people
of the
holding it
equipment
looked like
storage room.
ants.
When
Inside
we
the
slipped
glass
through the
box,
broken
noise came in
doorway,
distinct
the
layers.
temperature dropped
The most
noticeably,
intimate sound was
as if the
high-pitched
fire had
whine
stripped
of
the
electric
warmth out of
swing
the air.
motors, and the dull clank groan
What
of
remained of the
sluing ring
station's
under my feet
interior
when the
looked
jig
like
burned.
time had exploded here.
Beneath that, muffled by the
Burnt
safety
beams
glass, was
crisscrossed the
sight
floor,
noise.
metal
The
tools
relentless
twisted
beep,
from
beep,
heat
beep
lay
of backup
scattered,
alarms.
and
hiss of
ash
air
floated
brakes and
with
some
every
ironworkers
shift of our
swearing at a
breath, yet
stripped bolt.
somehow a small
Farther out,
silver
you got the
box
city
sat
soundtrack.
unburned on a shelf
Sirens
that was
wailing,
half
the rumble of
collapsed,
the highway, and
a
the
solar-powered
lonely horn of a
emergency
freight train
transmitter.
miles away.
Its casing
I
bore
kept my
scratches
world
and
simple
dents,
tight.
but the tiny
Lunch
power
was a
indicator
ritual.
flickered
A
green.
ham sandwich, a bruised apple,
Avery
and coffee
exhaled
from a
sharply.
scratched-up Stanley thermos
This
that
shouldn't
had
have
seen more
survived
job
the
sites
fire.
than most foremen.
Dalton checked the
I
wiring.
ate in the downtime.
It didn't
between
survive
lifts.
clean.
Radio turned
Someone
low,
disconnected
one
it
eye
before the
always
flames
glued to
spread.
the hook. The rule book
He met
said,
my eyes.
no distractions
Someone
during
left it
critical
for
picks,
us, or for anyone
which
desperate
basically
enough to look.
translated to, don't
We
be
placed the
idiot
transmitter
choking
on a
crust
cleared
of
section
bread
of
when
floor.
someone needs a
Avery
split-second
knelt
emergency
beside
stop.
it, hands
guys in the
steady
mud
despite
called
the
me
tremor
Sky
visible
Rat or
in her
joystick
jaw.
jockey.
She
They
flipped the
figured I had it
frequency
made.
dial slowly,
Up there in the
cautious not
penthouse,
to break
out of
the brittle
slush and the
switches.
freezing rain, sitting on my
Static
ass while they
crackled through the
busted their
tiny
backs,
speaker,
dragging heavy
warbling
hoses and
across
wrestling
empty
concrete
channels.
forms.
Then,
You could tell
Springs,
exactly what they really
do you
thought
copy?
the first time a newbie
Any
had to
remaining
climb
units?
up to bring me revised
Regroup at Manitou.
blueprints.
Evac corridor
By the halfway
compromised.
mark, they
Repeat.
were wheezing.
Manitou Springs.
By the time they
Fallback
dragged themselves
point.
through the hatch, they were
We
white-knuckling
froze.
the rails, trying not to
Each
look through
syllable
the
felt
floor
like a
grate.
breath of clean
People
air
think
after
they're
days
fine with
underwater.
heights until there's nothing
Avery
between their
pressed
boots
her
and the
ear
asphalt
closer,
but air and
brow
a few
furrowed
steel
as the
bolts.
transmission
Most
sputtered in and
ships
out.
ended the same way.
Say again.
I'd park
Any
the hook
survivors?
just above head height near the
Colorado
laydown
National
yard,
Guard
locked
holding
the swing
perimeter.
brake and shut the cab
Dalton
down
leaned
strictly
forward,
by
gripping the
manual.
casing. They're
Power
alive.
off, windows
The
latched
voice
tight,
returned
radio clicked
faintly,
back into its
words
charging
fragmenting
cradle.
beneath static.
Then came the descent.
Escort teams
Climbing
relocating.
down is easier
Infected
on the
breaching
lungs, but
west.
harder on the
Hold
knees.
until
By the time I
silence
hit
overtook
dirt,
the
my
speaker
legs
so
usually
abruptly it felt like a
jelly.
door slamming
On the
shut.
ground, someone always
Avery
had a
tapped
wise-ass
the
comment
transmitter
ready,
lightly,
usually
trying to
about
coax
how I
the
was
signal
losing my
back,
hair or how
but
they
the
were gonna
frequency
grease the
dissolved
ladder
into
so I'd
cold
slide
white
down next
noise.
time. I'd
Try
just
responding,
shrug,
I
bump
said.
fists and walk out
She
the gate
hesitated
with the
only a
rest of the
second
herd.
before pressing the small
If
transmit
you'd
button.
asked me back then about
Manitou
danger,
Springs.
I would have
This is
talked
3
about sudden
survivors on the
wind shear,
Pike Ridge Fire
blind
lookout
lifts where I
trail.
couldn't see the
Tower
load, or a
compromised,
cable
seeking
snapping
extraction.
under tension.
Do you copy?
I wouldn't
Her
have
voice
said a word
cracked
about
only once.
disease or riots.
We waited.
The biggest risk
Nothing.
I thought I faced was
She
a
tried again,
thunderstorm
adjusting the
rolling in
dials.
fast from the west.
This is
while I
Avery
had a
Holt,
load of steel in
formerly
the air,
stationed at Fort Carson.
or some fresh
2
laborer
civilians with me.
walking under a
We are
suspended
alive and
pallet with his
mobile.
brain
Repeat,
turned off.
alive and mobile.
We ran drills for power
The speaker
failures,
hissed,
for crane collapses, for
then
heart
crackled.
attacks. Nobody
Acknowledged.
ever ran a drill for
Hold
what to do if
position
the
until
whole damn
dawn.
city went
Perimeter
crazy at
unstable, I
once.
say.
I
We'll
did
attempt
notice the
contact at
cracks froze,
sunrise.
if I'm being honest. I
The
just
message
filed
wasn't
them under,
clear.
not my problem. A
It wasn't
siren that
long.
wailed for 20 minutes without
But it was
stopping.
enough.
Smoke on the horizon
Avery
that
lowered
was
the
too black
transmitter,
to be a
eyes
chimney
shining
fire.
in the dim glow.
More tents popping up under
Dalton
the
ran a
overpass every
hand
week.
through his hair,
More desperate-looking
letting out a
folks
breath
digging
he
through
didn't
the
know he
dumpster
was
behind
holding.
the 7-Eleven.
I leaned back against the
The news radio
soot-blackened
talked
wall,
about viral
letting the
outbreaks
weight
in
of it
other
sink
states,
in.
supply chain shortages,
There were
and press
survivors,
conferences where sweaty
organized
politicians
ones,
promised plans they didn't
somewhere
have.
down in Manitou
I heard it,
Springs.
sure.
A group strong
I
enough to
nodded along,
broadcast,
then I set
strong
my
enough to
alarm for
rescue,
4:30 a.m. anyway.
strong enough to anchor hope.
Routine was my anchor. Same
Then
climb,
a distant
same
crash
seat, same
snapped all
pre-flight
3 of our
checks.
heads toward the
I liked
broken
the
window.
logic of it. If I
The
did my
infected
part
had
and the
reached
riggers
the
did
west
theirs,
wall of the
steel
ranger
went where it
station,
belonged, and
their bodies
everyone went home
colliding
with
with
the same
charred
number of
beams.
limbs they started
The
with.
structure groaned
The
under the
world might
pressure,
have been sliding
a
into
long,
ditch
splintering
somewhere else,
sound
but
that
from my
echoed
cab,
through the
that
forest.
mess felt a million
They're
miles
shifting this
away.
way, Dalton
At least
whispered.
that's how it felt right
Avery
up until
grabbed
the
the
week
transmitter.
radios stopped sounding
We need
like
to
work
move.
and started sounding
Now.
like pure panic.
We slipped from the
The week
storage
the
room
world finally
and back
tipped
into
over
the thick
started out
shadows of the
deceptively
gully.
plain. Same
The
annoying
path
alarm
ahead
clock,
dipped
same
into a
burnt gas
grove of
station
dense
coffee, same
pines,
climb up
their
300
branches
feet of
forming a
freezing
dark
cold steel.
canopy that would hide us as we
Driving in, I
traveled.
let the news radio run.
The infected's
The host was
groans
breathless,
followed
talking
behind us,
about a severe
scattered
viral
but
outbreak
gathering
in the
strength
major
as
metro
more of them
areas.
noticed the station's
Hospitals at
collapse.
capacity, riots over baby
At the edge of the
formula,
grove,
police departments
Avery
stretched to the
paused,
breaking point.
clutching
It
the
sounded bad,
transmitter
sure,
to her
but it still
chest.
felt like
If they're
background
really holding
noise.
a perimeter down
Just
in
another
Manitou,
disaster
we might
happening to
actually
other
make
people
it.
in other zip codes.
Dalton adjusted his
By the
pack
time I
straps,
parked my truck
the
by
faintest
job
hint
trailer,
of
my
something
head was already
hopeful
shifting
touching
to
his
wind
expression. passion.
And lift charts, not worrying
Then we
about
move
whatever was
fast.
burning down on the other side of
Dawn's
the map.
our deadline.
At the main gate,
I glanced
the foreman,
once
a
more at the
bull-necked guy
smouldering
named
ranger
Miller,
station,
stopped us for a
the last
tailgate
barrier
safety
between
meeting.
us and whatever waited
He
ahead.
stood around the tool crib,
"Let's
stomping
go,"
our feet against the
I
cold,
said.
while he read
For the first
from a printout
time
of
since
a
the
corporate
outbreak hit
email.
the mountain, The
Wash
path
your
forward
hands.
didn't feel like
Don't share
running from
gloves or
death.
water bottles. Stay home if you're running a
It
fever.
felt like running
Report
toward
any
life.
unusual violent behavior near the perimeter.
We plunged into the pines with
One
the
of the iron
urgency of
workers,
people
a
who
guy who'd been
finally had a
divorced 3
direction worth
times,
dying
cracked.
for.
You met my
The
ex-wife.
forest swallowed us
A few
almost
guys
instantly,
snorted, shaking off
the ranger
tension, but the
station's
laughter
orange
died
glow
fast.
fading behind trunks thick
Miller
enough
didn't
to block
smile.
most of the
He just
moonlight.
dismissed us, and everyone
Branches
grabbed
slapped
their
our
hard hats
shoulders
and
as
went
we
back
pushed
to their
forward,
crews.
needles crunching
Concrete
underfoot
doesn't
in
wait for
soft
press
bursts
conferences.
that
I
sounded
climbed that
louder than
morning
they
with a
should
flimsy
have
paper
in the
mask
silence
pushed
of the
under my chin.
backcountry.
It felt stupid,
Every
like trying
sound
to
felt
stop a
like it
hurricane
carried
with
a
screen
warning.
door, but I wore it
The
anyway.
infected weren't
The
far
ladder felt
behind.
the same as
Their
always.
distant
Rungs
groans
biting
wove
cold
through the
my
night
gloves,
like
the
a
wind
thread
getting sharper
unraveling
and
just
meaner the higher
beyond
I
sight.
got.
Dalton
From the
led,
cab, the
weaving
city still
through
held its
tight
shape.
clusters of
Cars
trees
crawled
with the
along
precision
ring road.
of
White
someone
smoke
who had
drifted
spent
sideways
years
from the industrial
navigating
stacks,
rugged training
and the river
grounds.
slid past in that same
Avery
dirty brown
followed
curve.
close on his
If you
heels,
didn't stare too hard,
transmitter
you could
clutched
almost
tight
pretend
against
nothing
her
had
chest,
changed.
as if it were a
Around
fragile
mid-morning, the
heartbeat
site radio
that could
cracked
stop
with a
at
sound
any
harder than
moment.
static. One
I
of the
brought up the
laborers
rear,
yelled, "Creed,
checking our trail
park the hook.
constantly,
We got a guy
catching
down at the
fleeting
north
glimpses
fence."
of shadows
His
shifting
voice
between the
shook on the
pines.
last word, vibrating with the kind
Sometimes
of
it was
fear
just
you
the
don't hear
wind
on a
bending
construction
branches.
site. I
Other
immediately
times,
eased the joystick back, grounding
I wasn't
the
so
load,
sure.
and locked the controls.
The ground under us became
When I stood up and
increasingly
leaned
uneven,
against the cold glass,
roots
looking
twisted
down,
through the soil like
I
hidden
saw a tight
traps,
ring of orange
threatening to
vests
catch our
near the
boots.
gate. They were all
Dalton
bent over
slowed
something on the
only long
gravel,
enough
like they
to
were trying
whisper,
to hold down a
"Watch your
wild
footing.
animal.
Noise is
Miller
death
grabbed
right
the
now."
channel, his voice tight.
But the
Is
infected
it a
didn't seem to
fall?
rely on
Did he
hearing
slip?
it alone anymore.
The answer
They were
came
learning
back
the
fast
forest,
and breathless.
moving
No,
toward
boss, he just
vibrations, changes in
dropped.
airflow,
He's
the
on the
subtle
ground, he's
rhythms
thrashing
of
him.
life trying
Jesus,
to stay
he tried to
alive.
bite Matt when he leaned in.
A sudden crack behind
That
us
word
snapped
stuck in
our
my ear
attention
like a
backward.
burr. Bite.
Avery
Not
froze,
hit, not
one
punch,
hand gripping a
bite.
tree trunk.
I
I
watched one of
crouched
the crew jerk
immediately,
his arm
straining
back
to
violently
separate
and
natural
clamp a hand
sounds
over
from
his
something
sleeve.
unnatural.
Even from
Another
60
crack
meters
followed,
up, the motion of the
a
man on
branch
the ground
breaking
looked
under weight
wrong.
too clumsy,
It was too jerky,
too heavy to be an
violent, and
animal.
focused for a normal seizure.
They're
He
close,
wasn't just shaking.
I whispered.
He was snapping.
Dalton motioned sharply.
Sirens
Keep
cut
moving.
across the city background.
Ridge trails
less than
ahead.
A minute later, a
We
patrol
pressed
car
deeper.
rolled up to the gate,
The pines
tires
thickened,
crunching gravel,
turning the forest
followed by an
floor into a
ambulance that
maze of
stopped
interlocking
half in the lane,
shadows.
blocking
I
traffic.
could feel the
The cop
mountain
didn't
slope
stroll up.
steepening
He
beneath
got
us.
out with his hand
Every
already
step
resting on
angled
his holster.
downward as we followed
He
the
and two
narrow
medics went
draw
straight
toward
into the
Manitou
circle.
Springs.
No hesitation.
Cold
but
air
plenty of
funneled
tension.
between the trees,
One
carrying
medic
faint
grabbed the
whiffs
leg,
of smoke
the other
and the
went for
metallic tang
shoulders,
of
and the
blood.
cop put a knee heavily near
Whether
the
it was
man's
ours
jaw,
or theirs,
forcing his head into the dirt
I
to
couldn't
keep those
tell.
teeth away from everyone.
The first infected
It took all
emerged
three of
silently
them
at our
straining
rear,
to strap him down.
a dark silhouette stumbling
Even
through
on
a
the
break
stretcher,
in the
guy
brush.
bucked hard enough that the
Its
gurney
limbs
almost
jerked
tipped.
with unnatural
They
rhythm,
had to pin him again,
its eyes
brutally
reflecting the
this time,
smallest
before
glint
they
of
could shove him
moonlight.
into the back of the rig
It
and
wasn't
slam
running,
the doors.
but it had locked onto
In
us,
less than 10
its
minutes,
body
they were
turning
gone.
with eerie precision
No one
as it
waved up to me.
adjusted its path.
No one talked on the radio for a
Avery
long
saw
time.
it too.
When
"We
Miller
need to
finally
speed up,"
clicked on and said,
she breathed.
"All right,
"We can't
clear the
outrun
area,
them
back to
downhill,"
work."
Dalton
His voice
hissed.
sounded thin.
"We used the
hollow.
terrain."
At lunch, the
He
rumor mill
veered
went
sharply
into
toward a
overdrive.
cluster of granite
Some said the
boulders
sick guy
jutting
had
from the
arrived
earth
late,
like
eyes
ancient
glassy
teeth.
and vacant.
We followed,
Others claimed he
scrambling
tried
up
to
the
take a
uneven
chunk out of
surface
anyone
while
who
the
touched him.
infected navigated the
One
slope
guy
below
swore he
with
saw the
clumsy
cop draw his
but
service
determined
weapon and then
steps.
hesitate before pushing
Their
it back
hands slapped
down.
rock, leaving
No one
smears
had
we
the
didn't
whole
want to
picture, but the
investigate.
pieces were ugly.
From the
The
top
worker
of the
had walked
boulder
through the
cluster
gate
we
at
could
6
see more of
a.m.
them
and left
drifting
strapped to a
between the
gurney at
trees.
10.
Half a dozen
That
at
part
least,
was
maybe
solid
more
fact.
hidden by the thicker
That night I
groves.
tried to get more
The
from
forest
news.
wasn't
They
theirs
gave
yet,
our site
but their
exactly
persistence
one line
made it
about a
clear.
medical incident during
It soon
construction
would be.
operations.
Dalton
No
pointed
details,
toward a
no
narrow
names.
corridor of rock.
Then
Through
they
there,
shifted to shaky
they'll
phone footage
bottleneck.
from another city.
We slipped into the
People in
natural
hospital
choke
gowns were
point.
walking into oncoming
Granite
traffic,
walls pressed
faces
close
blank
on
and
either
slack,
side,
while
forcing
riot
us to
police
move
tried
single
push them
file.
back with shields.
Avery stumbled once,
The
catching
anchor
herself on the
used calm,
stone.
polished
I
phrases
turned
like,
just in
Isolated
time to see a
events and
shadow
situation
collide
under
with the boulder
investigation.
behind us. The first
video loop
infected
behind
slamming
showed
its shoulder
barricades
into the
shaking
rock,
and medics backing
reaching
away
with
from their own
clawed
patients
fingers
in terror.
that dragged grooves into the
The next
stone's
morning, the
surface.
change hit our neighborhood.
Dalton
The
lowered
freeway
his
into
voice.
town, usually a
Do
parking
not
lot,
stop.
was almost clear at
Whatever
rush
you
hour.
do,
It was
don't
eerie.
let them touch you.
I passed a grocery
The
store with a
infected
line
moved
stretching
slower
out
in
the
the
door
tight
and around
pass,
the block.
their bodies
Two people
scraping
were
against the
screaming at
rock
each
as they
other over a
pushed
cart
through,
full of bottled water,
but their
ready to
persistence
throw
filled the
hands.
narrow corridor with a
At the
suffocating
gas station
tension.
near the site, the water
One
aisle was
wrong
stripped
step,
bare,
One
clerk had a
slip,
mask
and
dug
they'd be
deep
on
into
us.
his face, and his eyes followed my
We
every
burst
move
out the
like I
other
was about
side
to
just as
rob
one
the place.
infected reached the midpoint of
On
the
the tiny
squeeze,
TV behind
arms
him, the same
pinwheeling
anchor
in
was now
frustration
using the
when it
words
realized the
confirmed
gap
attacks
widened
instead
too
of
slowly to
incidents.
keep our pace.
On site,
Dalton seized the
maybe a third of the
opportunity
crew
and
was
used a
wearing
loose
masks
branch
now.
to send small rocks
Some were
tumbling
fresh
behind us,
N95s,
slowing the
others
pursuit
were
further.
dirty rags pulled out of old
Avery
toolboxes.
cast one
The
last look
company had
back,
stacked boxes of
her breath
masks at the
shaking.
gate and set a pump
That
bottle of
bought us
hand
seconds,
sanitizer on the break
she whispered.
table.
Not
Like a
minutes.
squirt of alcohol
Seconds
gel
were
was
enough.
going to stop something the hospitals
We continued
couldn't
downhill
handle.
until the forest opened into a wide, sloped clearing where the moon lit the earth more generously. A faint trail, barely a deer path, cut across the space. On the far end, the land dipped into a corridor that led towards Manitou Springs. Avery pulled the transmitter from her pack, adjusting the dial with trembling fingers. "We need to let them know we're moving," she said. "If they send an escort, we have to be somewhere visible." Dalton shook his head. "Not yet. If the signal ping's too strong, it'll bring the infected." "Then we wait," I said. "A little further. Somewhere we can defend if we have to." But the infected had different plans. A chorus of moans rose behind us. Louder, closer, their disunity forming an almost rhythmic surge. Shadows poured from the upper ridge, spreading through the clearing like a tide seeking low ground. Their numbers had grown, drawn by the bear, by the tower collapse, by the fire, by everything we'd done to survive. Avery lifted the transmitter anyway. Dalton grabbed her wrist. "Avery, I'm not dying on this mountain," she said, voice trembling but fierce. "And neither are you." She pressed transmit. "Manitou Springs. 3 survivors en route. If you can hear us, we're coming through the pines. We need guidance. We need a signal. We need—" A roar from the ridge drowned out her last word. The infected broke into a lurching, unified advance. Dalton slung his rifle. "No more running. Not until we break their line." I stepped beside him, adjusting my grip on the hatchet. Avery tightened her pack straps, transmitter still warm in her hand. The forest erupted around us, and the fight for the ridge began. I climbed the ridge at dawn after the fighting, each step a slow negotiation with loose stone, and the memory of the tower's shadow behind me. The firelight that had licked the ranger station the night before had turned the valley into a bruised map. From this height, the town looked like an altar of small wreckage stitched with glints of flame. I paused at the crest and drew a long breath. The air tasted of ash and pine and a metallic note that warned that the world had been reordered. The Watchtower stood on the horizon's lip, a thin silhouette beyond the blackened trees, leaning as if it had been pushed and then refused to fall. It felt smaller and larger at once. Smaller because its refuge had failed us, and larger because its absence marked the line where everything changed. I let my gaze travel the ridge and catalogued the scene with the same quiet inventory that had kept me alive. Stopped cars, a burned storefront, a collapsed awning where someone had fought until they could not. I remembered arranging nails and stakes into the tower's soil, the way my hands had mapped danger into geometry, and felt a domestic soreness of regret at leaving those labours behind. That place had been a theatre of decisions, tightening bolts, setting watches, arguing over when to move, and now it waited as a monument to choices, quiet as a wound. As the sun lifted, heat braided smoke into thin threads that tooled the sky. The ranger station's ruin exhaled slow curls of grey. Down below, the river pocketed detritus, and roadways snarled into immobile lists of metal carcasses. People moved as patches of motion among the wreckage, improvising routes and carrying what could be stuffed into hands and packs. I thought of the 3 of us moving through the mountain the night before, how we had kept each other awake, and how fear braided into companionship until leaving became our only plan. The sound of all that, distant and swallowing, made me keep my shoulders tight beneath my pack. I drew the small notebook from my coat and flipped to the page where I'd written the tower's coordinates the first night I arrived. Ink had smudged with sweat and smoke, but the numbers remained legible. I wrote a note then, quick and deliberate. Tower 39.0 XXN-105.1XXXW. Stood and fell. We left toward Manitou. Be careful. My handwriting felt too small for what it meant, so I folded the paper and tucked it between rocks in a shallow cairn at the ridge edge. It was both map and message, the kind of mark people make when they want to be found, or when they want the world to remember they had been here. The wind sharpened, and I imagined the tower's timbers creaking, as if in conversation with the mountain. I pictured the bolt I had torqued down the second day, the crowbar's notch where my hand had reefed against resistance, and the radio's faint voice that promised a link and then went quiet, like a candle snuffed. Memory kept small artifacts crisp, the lantern's warm glass, the echo of boots on metal steps, the loose nail I'd hammered back into place. Those details felt like an inventory of a life reduced to survival. For a long moment I let myself stand in the balance between past and what lay ahead. The tower's silhouette was a thin vertical that separated scrub of the known from the messy sprawl of the unknown. It no longer offered shelter, it offered an ending and a starting point all at once. I ran my thumb along the edge of the rock where I'd tucked the note, grit pressing into my skin like a tally. Then I turned away and set my boots towards the trail to Manitou Springs. The radio's faint promise hummed in my head, a brittle thread to follow, and the transmitter in Avery's pack was a small emergency of light and signal waiting to be trusted. We had carried more than water and tools down the mountain. Decisions, apologies, and a stubborn hope that was less a feeling than an arrangement of will. Each step downhill required surrendering the tower entirely and accepting a path that might demand new choices. I rehearsed the orders I'd give if anyone asked where we'd come from, that a watchtower had stood and we had left because staying meant becoming part of its ruin. I prepared to give coordinates, the cairn's small map of stacked stones, the note tucked into rock. Practical gestures clear enough for someone rescuing us. The world below had become an archive of such gestures, messages, marks, small graves, and stacked stones. By the time the pines thinned into the shoulder road, a cloud of movement gathered onto the far bank where people coaxed broken engines and pushed carts. Children's voices, thin and brittle with fear, touched the air, and a hollow ache pushed under my ribs. The landscape had become a ledger. Each burned breath logged a cost. The watchtower would become another line in that account. I kept moving, and with every step the ridge receded until the tower became a small, dark notch against the brightening sky. The memory of tightening bolts and sleepless watches sat behind me like a ledger closed. The notebook in my pocket carried coordinates that could mean the difference between being found and being forgotten. I thought of convoys that might come, of a hand extended that could lead me to shelter. As the morning unfolded, I realized the watchtower had not failed because iron betrayed it. It failed because the world redefined safety. We had to learn that definition again from scratch, with sore feet and the stubbornness of people who refuse to be ledgered without resistance. When the trail dipped and the town's broken edge came into view, I steadied my breath and carried the quiet proof that we had survived a place that once promised refuge. I walked on with the cairn's note tucked into the rock behind me, a small act of testimony. The ridge and the tower would remain as both warning and testament. What we left behind was a map for anyone brave or desperate enough to search. My steps carried me down into the broken town, where strangers made fragile alliances and every small decision would be the next line in a story we hoped to keep writing. I did not look back again for long. The silhouette shrank, then blurred into the raw morning light, and the work of moving forward began in earnest.